Joining us now is Washington DC correspondent at UnHerd, Emily Jashinsky. Emily, so good to speak to you again. California Governor Gavin Newsom, he clearly wants to be president. He's launched this new podcast, This is Gavin Newsom. And during his interview with conservative and founder of Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk, he was really trying to distance himself from woke issues. And he's now facing backlash from LGBTQI+ groups after admitting that biological men in women's sport, well, it's not that fair after all. What's your take on this? I want to know how it's going to be received, because the right knows that Gavin Newsom is just full of BS, and the left are now outraged about his new position on this. What's your take?
It's incredibly hard to know what Gavin Newsom actually believes, because the intensity of his position on issue A, or on point A on this issue, to point B on this issue in just a short time is such a dramatic switch. It's not just a matter of saying, I've seen some new studies and realized that maybe I was wrong. He's now saying that something the left defended as necessary to prevent bigotry is, quote, deeply unfair. That's what he told Charlie Kirk. We've seen other Democrats try to do the same since the November election, and it really seems like the only thing that changed was the election, which woke them up to sort of the simmering cultural problems Democrats have had with average voters. So I don't know, truly, what Gavin Newsom actually thinks about this issue, but I do know one thing he thinks about this issue, which is that it's politically toxic for Democrats to continue offending so many average Americans and turning them off by insisting that men and women are biologically interchangeable. And because of that, men's and women's, girls and boys sports need to be upturned, whether it's the locker room policy or actually on the field, bathroom policy in the schools themselves, or even, for adults in public spaces. He knows that Democrats have become toxic, and that's about the only thing we can be certain of. Gavin Newsom actually believes here. And also, there's one other thing, to your point, the guy wants to be president. It's the only reason that's changing.
And what do you make of even the fact that he's launching this podcast? I mean, so many residents in California are still suffering after the worst fire disaster the state has ever seen. California is suffering with the problems of homelessness. He's been a leader that has been so pro-DEI projects. So now that he's spending his time launching a podcast, getting someone like Charlie Kirk on, are people going to buy it? Are they going to listen to him and think, okay, that's what a strong leader is, that he's spending his time trying to reach more people through podcasting?
Yeah, I hate to say it. I think the podcast decision on his behalf was smart. Like, the medium or the vehicle for speaking to people is smart, but I think he's doing it for all of the wrong reasons, which are to sort of persuade people that he is, and this is what we've seen Democrats try to do since the November election, relatable, that he is authentic, that he can just speak off the cuff with other guys like Charlie Kirk, and he can riff on trans sports, and he can talk about alleged book bans, and he can do all of it off the cuff without a teleprompter, without being scripted. That's what he's trying to prove by moving to the podcast format. That way he gets clips into the news cycle's bloodstream on social media, Instagram, TikTok, X. But Gavin Newsom wants to be someone who can persuade voters. He's authentic and just easy to talk to, someone you'd want to get a beer with. I don't know that he actually is. I think that's going to be the biggest problem for him with this podcast, is he is an enormously wealthy man who is now also trying to sing a different tune. And that's going to rub people as inauthentic. And that's basically been the response that he's gotten in the last couple of days. So, I mean, I think politically what he's saying about some of these cultural issues is a sign that the Democratic Party is starting to wake up. And the fact that they're trying to talk to people like Charlie, that's a sign that they're willing to wake up. But can they actually pull it off? That's the next question. It's the most important question, and it's open right now.
Yeah, it certainly is. Well, the other person who also wants to be president is a failed vice president candidate, Tim Walz. Now, his reflection of the election campaign is absolutely insane. He told Politico that he thinks that he and Kamala Harris just played it too safe last year, and they should have held more town halls because they really went down so well. But Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison also told Politico that Tim wished that they would have put him out there more because the world seemed to want more Tim Walz, and there were times when I wish they could have gotten more of Tim Walz. I mean, I don't even know how to say that with a straight face. It's absolutely ridiculous. What are Tim Walz's chances here?
I mean, remember when ahead of the election, he was playing video games on a Twitch stream with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They weren't exactly keeping Tim Walz bottled up, but I haven't seen a lot of people connecting the two dots here, which is one, Tim Walz saying that they were too risk averse, they played it too safe, and B, Tim Walz particularly complaining to people in power broker Democratic circles that he wasn't used enough, that he was underutilized. Well, they were actually pretty concerned, it appears, that Tim Walz, left to his own devices, would be a little bit unhinged. He would not be good for the ticket. And I think Walz is resentful of that. But he went out in that debate with J.D. Vance. I mean, they let Tim Walz do that, and it wasn't good for him. So he's right, exactly. And I think the left thinks that Tim Walz was he was kept in this box by the Harris campaign and not allowed to be super progressive because they were worried about losing centrists or independents. But at the end of the day, if Tim Walz had gone unscripted, he would have ended up saying the same things about, for example, we were just talking about trans sports. He can't avoid that. It doesn't matter how he's talking about it if he is still espousing the same policy that offends average Americans.
Absolutely. And I think his argument doesn't really make sense. You know, he was sitting next to Kamala Harris during her first sit down with CNN. He was out on stage plenty of times. We certainly saw enough of Tim Walz. That reflection of his, I don't think it's going to help him in the future. But I want to talk to you about Canada. Mark Carney is being described as a Trudeau 2.0. He won the Liberal Party leadership in a landslide, and he's set to become Canada's next Prime Minister. Now, of course, the trade war between the United States and Canada has played a pretty key role in this result, and Mark Carney was pretty quick to take aim at Donald Trump, insisting that Trump won't win in the trade war. Here he is.
Someone who's trying to weaken our economy. Yeah, Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, as we know, has put, as the Prime Minister just said, unjustified tariffs on what we build, on what we sell, on how we make a living. He's attacking Canadian families, workers, and businesses, and we cannot let him succeed.
Interesting that Trump is having a bit of a reverse effect in Canada. Many people, I suppose, are feeling nervous about how the tariffs are going to impact them. But what's your assessment of Mark Carney's appointment, and what does it mean for the relationship between Canada and the United States?
Well, the problem for Carney is, by his own logic, if Donald Trump's tariffs are an attack on the jobs and livelihoods of Canadian families, it's very easy for Trump to reverse that and say, actually, Canada is attacking American jobs and families. Does he want, for example, those jobs that were just brought to Indiana by Honda because of the tariffs to all of those families that are going to be supported in Indiana? Does Mark Carney want those incomes to support families in Canada? That's the problem with that logic. It's right on point to Canadian audiences. That's exactly what they want to hear, but it's foolish and tone deaf when you're negotiating with Donald Trump. There have been really, I think, smart comparisons made recently between the way Mexican president, and a fairly progressive Mexican president, by the way, Claudia Sheinbaum, and Justin Trudeau, and now Mark Carney and their party in general, have handled these negotiations with Donald Trump. The contrast is really, really stark, and Claudia Sheinbaum probably has almost all of the same frustrations as Mark Carney, but she's been able to operate much more deftly and gain Donald Trump's respect. And what doesn't gain Donald Trump's respect is this sort of bullhorn grievance politics from Canada. It's not what Donald Trump wants to hear. The problem for Mark Carney is it's what the Canadian public wants to hear, but it's really going to further upset the White House and make their situation worse in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point. Look, let's talk about DOGE. The Department of Government Efficiency has announced a further wave of contract terminations, noting that they identified thousands of cases where more than $300 million in loans were granted to children. Yes, children. The loans were issued in 2020 and 2021 while the world was struggling with the COVID pandemic, and it's not even clear what they were used for. I mean, what's the reaction been in DC to the cuts, to what DOGE is finding? We just keep getting more and more evidence of waste.
Yeah, and the problem is a lot of the legitimate cases of waste, fraud, and abuse are being conflated with some of the more like politically inflammatory, although I would argue popular policies, like, for example, DEI. The people on X have spent the last week arguing legitimately about transgender mice and whether Donald Trump was right in his joint address to Congress to talk about $8 million going to transgender mice, and that being a point of DOGE. But DOGE is also actually genuinely finding some inefficiencies in the federal government. And that's something that Democrats, we've seen a couple of Democrats come out and say, we should have done this. Why didn't we own this issue? The government is this stumbling leviathan, and it has all of these problems. This is bipartisan. And, Democrats now look at Republicans and say they're owning this issue that we owned with Bill Clinton in the 1990s. And it's bad politics for them because there are some legitimately awful cases like this one.
Absolutely. And you see people protesting and you just can't really even understand their argument when there are so many receipts being delivered every single day. But finally, Emily, there are more scare campaigns around Donald Trump because there haven't been enough of those. The new attack line is that Donald Trump could cancel elections. Joe Walz, she's a former Illinois Republican congressman who ran for president in 2020, went on MSNBC to say this about the president.
I think, Michael, the biggest failure of all of us during this Trump era has been the failure of imagination. We have not imagined how bad and how low he'd go. He tried to overthrow an American election 4 years ago. I have no doubt that he could try to stop the midterm elections. If he's physically able, he may try to run again in 28. This is really scary.
It is scary, Eugene.
I mean, I think some of us need to come back down to reality. We need to use our imagination more about what Trump could possibly do. It's not a very strong case.
And it's actually dangerous for the left to start making that argument because there is a serious effort on the American right. It's very small right now and it shouldn't be overstated. But at places like CPAC, there are legitimately arguments being made that Donald Trump should run for a third term, not that he should just appoint himself to a third term. And I don't particularly agree with this. I'm happy to hear the argument out, but there are people who want that. The problem for the left is that if they say he's just being dictator and he's just going to appoint himself and cancel elections, they're going to numb people by overshooting it. If there's a legitimate argument to be made about Donald Trump saying the Constitution should be amended to allow him to run for a third term, so it's not helpful at all, and it's just what Joe Walsh has been doing, sadly, for the better part of the last decade.
Emily Jashinsky, Washington DC correspondent at UnHerd. Thank you so much for joining us on Power Hour.
Thank you.